Did a devastating catastrophe occur in ancient times? All over the world, we find magnificent sites that were apparently struck by something terrible. But what event ultimately brought these stone giants, which were actually built to last for eternity, to their knees? Well, we may find the answer to this question in the ancient Egyptian city of Tanis, or rather, in what is left of it today. After all, this site looks more like a wild, chaotic battlefield than a classic city of ruins. And for some, its melted statues are proof that the ancient Egyptians once found themselves in the middle of a full-blown apocalypse. What was the capital of ancient Egypt? Well, given the overwhelming monumental buildings that catch our eye here and attract countless visitors every year, you might think that the ancient Egyptian rulers resided in Gaza. But that's not true. In fact, Tanis is considered to be the first capital of the pharaohs, even though its existence has only been handed down in writing and no historian knows exactly where it is during the first dynasty around 3000 BC. But the matter becomes somewhat clearer in the following period. Located near present-day Cairo, Memphis became the centerpiece of Egyptian urban life from 2620 BC at the latest, followed by places like Thebes, Avaris, and not least, Tanis. But be honest, have you ever heard of Tanis before today's video? If you have, you will certainly already know that the site in the northeastern Nile Delta was even suspected at times of being Pi Ramesses, and thus nothing less than the ancient Egyptian capital that was built from scratch around 1278 BC at the behest of Ramses II. However, in the course of more recent findings, this equation turned out to be a mistake, and researchers now assume that Tanis was built at the beginning of the so-called Third Intermediate Period, which did not begin for another 200 years. As already mentioned, Tanis was supposed to serve as the capital of the entire Egyptian Empire in the meantime, and many powerful rulers of the 21st and 22nd dynasties were buried here. These were the kings Susanna I, or Sorkin II, and Shishong III, whose tombs were awakened from their millennia-long slumber between 1939 and 1946 by the French Egyptologist Pierre Monet. And while in the cult film Raiders of the Lost Ark, Tanis was the hiding place of the legendary Ark of the Covenant, a glance away from the movie screen also suggests the intriguing conclusion that something once took place here that is difficult to explain by earthly means. The first researchers to take a closer archaeological look at the site in the second half of the 19th century were Auguste Mariette and Flinders Petrie. However, the images that were taken during this process show us a city that is, to put it mildly, in a precarious state. Because what was once the pride of the ancient Egyptians was, at the time of its rediscovery, nothing more than a hopeless pile of ruins. An unimaginable field of destroyed statues, obelisks, and buildings. And in view of this, it is not particularly surprising that the experts needed more than 10 years to completely uncover the site. The confusing traces of devastation. But what does the situation actually look like today? Well, mocking tongues would probably say that those in charge have always tried hard, because the reconstruction of the experts consisted of draping the individual buildings in a museum-like arrangement, which, however, might have nothing to do at all with the original cityscape. In the same breath, however, this does not mean that the traces of devastation were completely eliminated. Quite the opposite. Tanis is still adorned with countless ruins, apparently in pieces, scattered all over the landscape. But what on earth happened here in the first place? After all, we are not dealing with delicate paper houses here, but with stone colossi, often made of rose granite. How the rose granite was brought to Tanis is, by the way, another question altogether, because researchers assume that it came from a quarry over 1,000 kilometers away. In any case, it is a fact that Tanis is also home to the remains of an almost ridiculously large giant, which, with an original height of an estimated 28 meters, was easily one of the largest statues of antiquity. But just like the other buildings at the site, this stone giant was brought to its knees by something. And it gets even more surprising when we consider that the statue was carved out of a single block of stone and weighed a good 1,100 tons. But what clues do we have about the fate of Tanis? Could it be that the city fell victim to a hostile army that literally left no stone unturned? Well, who knows? But perhaps the solution to this historical puzzle is hidden in the Old Testament. To understand the relevant verses correctly, however, we must first realize that the ancient Egyptian city of Tanis is equated with the biblical city of Zon. And in this regard, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 30 states, "Thus says the Lord God, I will destroy the idols. I will bring about the end of the gods of Memphis. The prince of Egypt will soon be no more. I will plunge Egypt into anguish. Patros I will devastate. Zon I will burn. No, I will execute." A massive fire disaster? But regardless of whether divine or not, wouldn't it be possible that Zon or Tanis was really destroyed in a fiery catastrophe? After all, there is one thing we should not forget. Some of the Tanis debris, above all a series of strange statues, do indeed look as if they were once exposed to immense heat. Covered in pitch-black spots reminiscent of burn marks, some artifacts even look as if they had melted in places. Those who are convinced of this fire hypothesis also point to the satellite images of the site. From a bird's-eye view, Tanis looks like a strange bald spot in the middle of a densely built-up, but above all, green environment. The question of what intensity and type of heat would have been necessary for hardly a blade of grass to sprout from the ground at Tanis to this day is, of course, a completely different matter. But what do conservative historians have to say about the decay of the former capital? Well, so much in advance, it doesn't get any less confusing. It's probably not surprising that the long-established experts don't resort to a divine inferno of flames as an explanation. But what is surprising is the assumption that, according to official doctrine, Tanis was simply abandoned, and that was it. More specifically, a Nile arm dammed up with silt is said to have rendered the city harbor unusable, forcing the inhabitants to move on and leave their homes. That we are devastated when we are abandoned by our partner can probably be understood by everyone, but also by a full-fledged city? Did the buildings really fall apart completely because they were no longer maintained? But even if we assume that the ravages of time are responsible for the devastation of Tanis, some points remain that give us cause for skepticism. Above all, there is the fact that apparently all the valuable treasures were left behind in the city. In fact, when it was rediscovered, Tanis was one of the richest archaeological treasure troves of all time. The artifacts unearthed here included precious grave goods such as golden masks and silver coffins, as well as chains, amulets, pottery, and statues. Another explanation is based on the assumption that the inhabitants were driven out relatively suddenly by a severe Nile flood, even if today the city looks more as if a full-blown tsunami had swept over it. Tanis was not an isolated case. So far, so mysterious. But perhaps we should point out at this point that Tanis is by no means the only ancient Egyptian site that has now fallen apart into its component parts. After all, there is also Abusir on the west bank of the Nile. If you want to visit the site, you first have to get official permission and pay a considerable sum of money, but you will at least be rewarded with the sight of a place that looks as if a giant had emptied out his Lego blocks. In fact, this area was also characterized by countless, widely scattered stone blocks that no longer even hint at how Abusir may have looked in ancient times. This time, however, the official reason given for the site's condition is not the quirks of the Nile, but the theft of materials. In detail, many of the stones used here were removed and reused elsewhere. The stone thieves kindly left behind the hotly disputed core drillings of Abusir, though. And indeed, the circular drill holes in the very hard diorite rock regularly become the focus of heated debates about the true technological level of the ancient Egyptians. But that is a topic for another video. So what is the final word today? Does the debris field of Tanis provide incontrovertible proof that thousands of years ago a catastrophe of apocalyptic proportions occurred in Egypt? Well, not really, because at the end of the day, we are dealing here with a pure theoretical construct that is not considered certain. What is certain, however, is that the official explanations are also accompanied by some huge question marks, and that the true fate of the former capital of Egypt probably still remains in the shadows of the past. And so that our videos no longer hide in the shadow of YouTube for you in the future, you can now simply click on the subscribe button. We would be very happy for you to join our community so that you can stay up to date with the latest news. See you soon!